When the US authorized Executive Order 9066, only a few Nisei or older immigrants left. The US grew fearful that the Japanese Americans would not leave, so they forced the Japanese Americans to move by freezing their financial assets. Here is Paul Tomita, a survivor of the Japanese internment camps, to talk more about the situation.
Some of us were given hours to get rid of all our possessions, our businesses, our homes, our cars, our refrigerators, our animals. We couldn't even take our animals with us.
There were several cases where Japanese Americans fought against discrimination and the executive law. For many, this meant staying in houses, active protest, or using their voices. One specific case is Fred Korematsu, who in 1942 refused to go to a Japanese prison camp. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where he claimed that Executive Order 9066 violated the Fifth Amendment. At the end, he lost his case, but his act of protest inspired many. Any protests at this time were fruitless, and eventually Japanese Americans had to move. The planned internment camps had not been built yet, so the US looked for another way to remove the Japanese Americans. The US put Japanese Americans into assembly centers. There were 12 assembly centers in California, 1 in Washington, 1 in Oregon, and 1 in Arizona. Assembly centers were not built to store humans. They were often racetracks or large compounds meant to hold livestock. The conditions were horrible. There was no privacy. Here is Paul Tomita to explain more.
It was like a holding pen, for animals.
Japanese Americans were treated as livestock, so much so that they were stamped with digits, not names, to denote who they were. This is Paul's from when he was a child.
The assembly centers, they gave us numbers. Our last name is Tomita, Tomita. After this, our name was 11940. We lost our last name. They stuck it on, on us kids, we kids, like that. And everything that we took with us that we could carry had 11940.
Japanese Americans spent an average of 3 months in these centers. Each center had stables where at one time 3,800 Japanese Americans were housed underneath one roof. In one assembly center called the Tonfuran, stalls that were meant to house a maximum of 1 horse were now used to house 3 to 6 people. Multiple families would be squished into the same room. Each person was issued 1 blanket and 1 cotton mattress. The food was limited to the same repetitive meals, and the lack of medical attention led to an unhospitable environment. Japanese Americans had to work minimum wage in these camps by picking produce or farming. Most centers were surrounded by wired fences and watchtowers. Each center had a strict curfew at night and an early roll call in the morning. Policemen could enter any family room without a warrant, and there were inspections daily. Army regulations required that all meetings be conducted in English with as little Japanese as possible, though it would be wrong to say that the assembly centers restricted every freedom. In many cases, there were looser restrictions on Japanese Americans practicing religion, educating themselves, and playing around together. Confinement of the assembly centers resembled the soon-to-come internment camps. After a couple of months, these assembly centers would soon be empty. Around May 26, 1942, there was another mass mobilization movement. Japanese Americans were sent off to inland concentration camps. Many believed that the assembly centers were the end. Rather, they went to unfinished barracks. These internment camps were not fully built, and oftentimes the Japanese Americans had to help build the confinement themselves. The camps were in mostly deserts without any connection to the outside world. Each camp had a mess hall, a school, a hospital, barracks, bathrooms, and laundry facilities. In Chizu's case, the Japanese Americans in her camps were separated into barracks. Each room had 5 people. Sometimes her family would be sleeping with a total stranger. Every room had khaki army blankets and it was illuminated by one light bulb. The flimsy barracks were put up so quickly that many times Japanese Americans had to rebuild their own walls. In Paul's case, his barracks were made up of tar paper and wood and were almost useless against the dusty winds. Even worse, the weather was terrible. In the summers, it was incredibly hot and temperatures would reach up to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. During the winters, the temperature would easily go below freezing. The only thing to provide you heat in those winters would be stoves inside each of the barrack rooms. What was worse was that everything was public. Bathrooms, washrooms, meal rooms, and even barracks had almost no separators. You could hear every word from one family to another. There was no privacy.
Environment to be taken, from nice Southern California to a desert in the middle of nowhere, it seemed. And our camp was not finished yet, so it was quite dusty.
Dusty is an understatement. In many cases in these camps, parents had to cover their children's mouth with cloth in order to prevent dust inhalation.
Dust, anywhere there were holes, the dust came through. The dust came through the sides, the dust came through the roof. The dust even came from the boards underneath. When my parents found out, and my parents thought, oh, well, this is where we're going to be, the first thing they said is, Paul Jr., because my father's name is Paul Jr. is going to die here, and they said, he'll be the first to die here.
Furthermore, the security was hell. Like the assembly centers, each camp was surrounded by wired fencing and watchtowers.
There were 8 guard towers, 30 feet high, and it was manned by machine guns and with searchlights. And essentially what happens here is if the soldiers thought that we were trying to escape, they had the right to shoot us. And there were incidences.
In the internment camps, Japanese Americans were often treated unjustly and were denied many human rights. Paul and Chizu were children when they were detained, and like 30,000 other Japanese American children, they needed education. No budget or plan had been set aside for these camps, so managing and creating an education facility was incredibly difficult. The schools had little supplies and were not managed very well. Each apartment of a school was like a prison cell with only a couple of rooms packed with many children. Teachers were also hard to come by. In some cases, the student-to-teacher ratio was as high as 48:1. Many rooms would be extremely hot in the summer and so cold in the winter. Even through mistreatment, Japanese Americans were able to keep their culture and tradition alive. There were Japanese Americans who still practiced religion, wrote in newspapers, and played games. The close-knit communities created a renewed love for fun activities. One was athletics. In Japanese internment communities, they often formed teams, traded sports cards, and founded athletic competitions like baseball. In these camps, Japanese Americans attempted to seek better treatment.